Hello and welcome to the Federalist Files, where I, your beloved host, breaks down the Federalist Papers into a consumable format for you, the viewer, and the listener. Here it's going to be a Federalist paper review. We're going to be going through Federalist number 6. Title is Concerning Dangers from Dissensions Between the States. It's written by Alexander Hamilton, so it's a little bit of a switchover because the last three we had was John Jay, and it was written on November 14th, 1787. Topics of discussion here are mutual commerce, political class, greed, and mutual commerce for the common defense, not in the way that you would think it is, but that commerce is going to stop factions and infighting and insurrections, not in the way where you have that commerce to fund defense, but in a totally different way. So I'm going to get started here. The very beginning of this paper, Hamilton begins with, and I quote, "I shall now proceed to delineate dangers of a different and perhaps still more alarming kind, those which will in all probability flow from dissensions between the states themselves and from domestic factions and convulsions." End quote. So what he's referring to here is really what the theme of this paper is going to be all about. It's the dissensions that will ensue from a impowerful government, a weak government, a feeble government. And I have another quote here. And I quote, "The subdivisions into which they might be thrown would have frequent and violent contests with each other." End quote. Here he's just referring to what's gonna come up later in this paper. He goes through a huge history lesson in this paper. It took a lot to show prep this one just because there's so much information. To consider a continuation of harmony between these independent sovereigns currently, because it is not a United States. He explains it as, and I quote, "would be to disregard the uniform course of human events," end quote. So here he's alluding to say that these states are going to stay, these confederacies, these separate sovereignties, not under a unified government, are going to stay harmonious between each other. They're going to be peaceful. They're going to have amiable relationships, is just being ignorant of history. And that's why I said this is going to be a very, very heavily derived history episode here, because there's just so much information that he goes through. It's pretty much like I felt like I was back in high school history class with all the stuff that he talks about here. In this paper, he thoroughly debunks that confederacies without a federal government won't have dissension. And he also debunks that monarchies too as well had dissensions that did lead to factional violence, which I did allude to in some earlier papers. But it's not something that you can say is only in republics, because in republics that would happen a lot. There was fights because the federal government was so weak and there was no one to answer the question when there was fights. And then it was constantly a switch over of power because there was no one powerful enough to really take hold and defend principles and defend that government structure. So it would often collapse. It was unstable. And another quote here, and I quote, "The causes of hostility among nations are innumerable. There are some which have a general and almost constant operation upon the collective bodies of society. Of this description are the love of power, or the desire of preeminence and dominion, the jealousy of power, or the desire of equality and safety," end quote. Here what he's referencing is that hostility among nations, among neighboring countries or neighboring sovereignties, it can derive from so many different factors. It could be, you're jealous of their resources, you're jealous of how much money they have, their commercial gain and growth, or just the desire of equality and safety is probably the most fair one. If you're going to have, revolutionary wars like we did, that one was really more derived from that desire of equality and safety, much more than it was a love of power or desire for dominion over somebody else, as he explains here. This is a common theme in the philosophy behind the creation of the Constitution. Throughout these papers, the authors explain the many flaws of man and government institutions, and they wrestle with the scales and the proportionality of power between the branches of government and the people. Throughout these papers, and they institute what they believe is the best resolution to this conflict. Really, that's what a lot of the papers is about, and it's to try to really what the papers are about, and the government that we have instituted is the best way to try to cover up human flaws. That's essentially what we're trying to do. We're trying to remedy the human condition, moreover. And then he cites, I have a quote here, Hamilton explains the characterize the political class throughout history, and I quote, "Men of this class, whether the favorites of a king or of a people, have in too many instances abused the confidence they possessed, and assuming the pretext of some public motive, have not scrupled to sacrifice the national tranquility to personal advantage or personal gratification," end quote. So really what he's saying, men of class, whether it's a king or it's a noble, someone that has a lot of money or commercial value, has always been willing, without any type of regard for anybody else, without hesitation, to sacrifice everyone else for personal achievement and personal gratification or self-aggrandizement. And then this is where the history lesson really begins here. He starts to talk about the greed of the political class throughout history, using examples as he cites the prime minister to Henry the Eighth of England. Prime minister at this time was, I think, a religious figure. Maybe I'm wrong. I mean, I did so much reading trying to figure out what the heck's going on in this one, and he talks about this prime minister for his own self-aggrandizement and an acquisition of a better position within the government. He causes a war with Emperor Charles V of Spain. So there's a war between England and Spain just because this guy wanted to start it because he wanted a better position in the government. And then Hamilton states here, and I quote, "Those who have but a superficial acquaintance with the sources from which they are to be drawn will themselves recollect a variety of instances, and those who have a tolerable knowledge of human nature will not stand in need of such lights to form their opinion either of the reality or extent of that agency," end quote. So here what he's referencing is people that are fake. He says people that have these fake acquaintances or these fake relationships, and they've never actually ran into these instances of people that are rapacious or self-aggrandizing. They're interested in their own self-greed. He says they won't see these instances. They won't be transparent to them. And what he said, and then after that he says, but people that are of tolerable knowledge, so people that are intelligent or well-informed of human nature, not only just well-informed as in, reading, but I guess human nature as in history, will not be able to stand there and form an opinion that is positive of this engagement. They'll be able to form their opinion, and they'll be able to, he explains them as astute or shrewd or sagacious, as in they're able to perceive what's going on, and they'll be able to see the reality. And then I quote, he states this is actually very interesting. He talks about almost something that broke into a civil war in America in 1787, which is actually the catalyst for the convention, for the Constitutional Convention, because the Articles of Confederation showed their true inadequacies. And I quote, "If Shays had not been a desperate debtor, it is much to be doubted whether Massachusetts would have been plunged into a civil war," end quote. So here what he is alluding to, Shays. Shays is an American revolutionary. He fought in Lexington Concord. He fought in a bunch of different battles during the Revolution. And him, along with 4,000 others, started a insurrection, or a riot in Massachusetts. They marched all the way down to the Springfield Armory in an attempt to overthrow the government over economic and civil rights issues, and they were eventually quelled by a state-run militia and private-funded militias. So what's really funny here is now the economic and civil rights issues. I'd imagine if you read deeper into it, it's probably just higher taxes. And at that time, they just did not have the money to pay those taxes off because the debt was so high. The amount of debt that was created during the Revolution was a very almost insurmountable amount of debt, and it was very difficult for the states with the federal government that was instilled with that Article of Confederation. It was difficult for them to collect the revenue to be able to pay off that debt because it really was a large amount of debt. And in doing so, what they would do is the best way that if they could possibly catch anybody and be able to collect from anyone, they would try to collect as much as they can from that one person. So it did cause a lot of inconsistencies in terms of the magnitude that some people would be taxed. I mean, some people were being taxed like crazy, and then others were not getting taxed at all. So that's probably really where it came from, the insurrection. And like I said, they were quelled by state-run militia and private-funded militias, this is a reason actually, and I like to get to this, is the reason why we have this military-industrial complex that we talk about, but we do not have private-funded militias. For obvious reasons, it would incentivize war. But we do have these big companies. If you notice, companies like Lockheed Martin, they create defense equipment, planes, bombs, stuff like that. If you notice, these 4-star generals in the United States military, if you look where General Mattis went after Trump fired him, that's where he went. I think he went to Lockheed Martin, or he went to one of those big conglomerates that build military weaponry. And that is a serious issue, this military industrial complex that we have, which is good that under the current administration we're really not we're very isolationist, which is a good thing, I think, for America and for troops in general. We don't want to send our young, our treasure, our the best that we have in this country overseas for fights that last for 20 years and we really get nothing out of it. And then that government that we instill there just gets overthrown anyway by a bunch of rebels. So what's the point, And this is another very subtle defense of the Second Amendment here, because it was able to be quelled by a state-run militia, and that's just individual gun owners at that point that were really they were somewhat trained, very ordinarily trained, and they were able to quell that insurrection. And Hamilton says this instance signifies the yearning of Americans to stay in a perpetual state of peace and maintain that propriety, or that decorum. And that's really, he's pointing to the state-run militia and the private-funded militias, that there are some Americans, no matter how anarchist it gets, there are people that are still willing to try to keep the peace and keep the stability. And then he states and this is a very important point, this is where we get to the commercial part, but he states, and I quote, "The genius of republics, say they, is pacific. The spirit of commerce has a tendency to soften the manners of men and to extinguish those inflammable humors which have so often kindled into wars. Commercial republics like ours will never be disposed to waste themselves in ruinous contentions with each other. They will be governed by mutual interest and will cultivate a spirit of mutual amity and concord," end quote. So here what he's referencing is the genius of a republic, a commercial republic, where everyone will have a mutual interest in trying to create commercial success. Because if you go out to, the bagel boys, you go out to the bagel shop to go get a bagel, and you don't have the money to buy their stock or buy whatever it is, and you own your own business and you're trying to run your business and you sell, you run a convenience store, you run a Krauser's. Sometimes maybe the business from the bagel boy owner will come over and he'll buy something from your business, keep you running, and then you'll go over to his business and you'll do the same thing. You'll buy something from his business. There is a mutual interest because in a commercial environment, rather than a slave ran environment or an environment that's run by the government in terms of economics, there is a mutual interest in everyone doing well because, like, for example, I am currently podcasting from a laptop. I use my money that I make doing my job to go and buy this laptop. This laptop was made by Apple or Microsoft. Now, I get that product, makes my life easier, makes everything much more feasible for me. It's accommodating with certain applications that are on it and softwares. And in doing that, it makes my life easier and they end up making money. Them making money. It goes down the ladder. More and more people get to see food on their table. So there is a mutual interest in commerce because you go to buy a product and you get that good and you pay for that good and no one's forcing you to buy that good. That's all voluntary stuff, especially trying to look around here. I don't want to say TV, but I want to say something that is not something that's necessary for survival. As you can see these flags on the back wall, that's something that's not necessary to my survival, but I buy it because I do like the product and I get it for a good price, and in doing so I keep food on people's table, and then they give me a good product. I'm happy. So that's really what he's trying to say, is that it will lead to happiness and a mutual interest amongst everybody to be as amicable as possible with each other. He says, these commercial interests will mitigate dissensions because everyone will have a state of mutual success. And next he goes on, he asks the rhetorical question, and I quote, "Have there not been as many wars founded upon commercial motives since that has become the prevailing system of nations as were before occasioned by the cupidity of territory dominion? Has not the spirit of commerce in many instances administered new incentives to the appetite both for the one and for the other?" End quote. So really here what he's saying is, have these wars, there's been wars that have been derived from commercial motives, but really as you continue to read, you'll notice what he's saying is and a lot of the examples he states is people that they have commercial motives and interests, but they're not able to achieve them in their own country because of the way the government structure is set up. And once you can achieve those commercial interests or motives and be able to get those goods for a reasonable price and be able to live what we call here the American dream, it ends up causing a dissension amongst the people and an appetite for destruction. And he cites in this paper the instances of Sparta, Athens, Rome, and Carthage as all republics, but only Athens and Carthage were commercialized republics. And he alludes to the carnage that was spewed in the conquest in both Rome and Sparta, comparatively to Carthage and Athens, where they did not see as many wars. Next, he refers to the provinces of Holland, because they were overwhelmed in debts and taxes that they could no longer pay. They played a huge part in the European wars, having furious contests with England for the sea, and fought with Louis the 14th of France. That's another thing they write here. Now, I did actually mention that in my last paper when I was talking about the Civil War in Europe. In Great Britain. I was talking about, I don't know if they had any type of foreign influence trying to get into their country, but I guess there was. I guess Holland, the provinces of Holland, were trying to fight them for the waters or the rights to that sea land there. Not sea land, but the sea territory. Now he then continues. He highlights that Great Britain always is pursuing but not able to really attain that commercial wealth, and they were most frequently amongst all at that time all the countries in the world. They're most frequently engaged in war, from the will of the people actually being one of them, and then the monarch. So the will of the people, they had their representatives in Parliament, and what he's saying here is Hamilton, the people actually wanted wars just as much as the monarch. So about half the wars are started by the monarch because you got a king there for his own self-aggrandizement. He wants to push his power. He wants to show how powerful he is. And then on top of that, you got the people, because the people aren't happy because there's no mutual commerce going on, and they're destitute. They're really living a poor life. They're impoverished. And that continued to, they engaged in war and war at this time in order to gain that not to gain that commerce, to gain that wealth. You had to take over land. It was imperialist, like I've stated before. So that's really just what he's referencing and trying to bring home in this throughout this paper. If there's a lack of, if you are lacking of that commercial interest, then there's going to be some dissension. There's going to be some problems, and it might not be amongst, if it's not amongst civilly within your states or within your territories, it's going to be with other nations, which is even worse. Then he explains, nearing the end here, he explains, and I quote, "The wars of these two last mentioned nations have in a great measure grown out of commercial considerations, the desire of supplanting and the fear of being supplanted, either in particular branches of traffic or in the general advantages of trade and navigation," end quote. So he's just bringing home exactly what I was saying. These last two nations, they're having all these issues because they're really looking for some sort of a commercial interest, which they can't achieve because the way their government structure is set up, it's not set up for people to have that mutual success and everyone be mutually bound and unified together in order to achieve it. And then he goes on to, at the very end here, he cites a gentleman named Abbé de Mablé, and I'm gonna have this up on the screen because he's a French guy, he's a French dude, and he's a philosopher, and he writes this piece. It's called Principes des Négociations, which I would imagine is Principles of Negotiations in that language there, and he writes it in English. I'm gonna quote it here, and I quote, "Neighboring nations are naturally enemies of each other unless their common weaknesses forces them to league in a confederate republic, and their constitution prevents the differences that neighborhood occasions, extinguishing that secret jealousy which disposes all states to aggrandize themselves at the expense of their neighbors," end quote. And then after that, you got Hamilton writes, "This passage at the same time points out the evil and suggests the remedy." So what he says is exactly what Hamilton is trying to pontificate this entire paper. He just keeps talking about everyone has to have a common camaraderie towards the goal of mutual commerce and success, and they'll have equity to lose if they partake in war with neighbors, and will be more willing to protect their neighbors from other enemies, thus creating a more concerted effort for peace and national defense. That's really what the theme of this paper is, and I'm hoping that we start to get into more of a rhythm of we start to talk about the different forms of government, the three branches, as well as the rights of the individual, the actual core functions, the reason for government. It's going to be talking about property, protecting the rights of the citizens, providing for the common defense, because this, after a while, doing the same thing over and over, I do understand it is very important to understand where the foundation of a lot of the policies come from, and the reason that we have the United States and we don't have the Confederate States or a confederacy. And then you also understand there was a civil war in this country. It wasn't only fought over slavery, but it was also fought over whether to have a confederacy or a union. That's why the North was called the Union and the South was called the Confederacy. So that's also interesting. That's something that isn't really pointed out when you go to public school. They don't even talk about that part. They just make it like the war was only about slavery. And then I've read different articles saying, Abraham Lincoln, one of the reasons that he wanted to abolish slavery too was that he didn't want England to even get involved, because he thought that if England got involved, they were going to get involved in the South, because then you could overthrow the North, because at the time, the Union was ran by Lincoln because Lincoln was the president. And in doing that, caused dissension. England can come back in with all of their influence and try to take over the country. So if he said, hey, we're abolishing slavery, he knew that in the hearts of the British and throughout history, it would make them look even worse if they came into the country and fought for the side that wanted the slavery at that time. So that's just, some information that I read. And that's going to be it for this one. This one's going to be coming out on Friday. I'm going to be having another paper coming out. Another video, and that's going to be a direct message video like I did the last one, talking about Joe Biden, the last one. But this one, I'm going to have to go through the Trump tax cut that I totally forgot to hit on in the last one. I had all my notes. I just don't know what happened. I must just pass right over it. But I'm going to hit that. I'm going to talk about these weird things that are going on with the media, calling for people to make a list. AOC, same thing. She's talking about making a list. And what was the other one? I was going to hit a little bit on the NFL and their new policy that they have, where they're going to give away 2 draft picks, third-round draft picks, in 1 year after the other year. So simultaneous years if you hire a black head coach. I'm going to hit on those 3 topics. If anything else comes up, I'll probably hit on those too. But I like to delve into politics a little and then get into culture, because as Andrew Breitbart did say, that politics is the downstream of culture. So you have to impact the culture to also impact the politics, especially in today's day and age with all the tech tyranny that's going on, and the shutting down, they're censoring people. So you got to get out there. You got to, anybody that's a conservative or anybody that is a libertarian that believes in the founding principles of free speech, you can't jump ship yet on a lot of these. If they kick you off, it's a totally different issue, a totally different situation if you get kicked off Facebook or Twitter, but you can't give up the ship. You can't give up the fight on these platforms just because they are monitoring you and they're doing whatever they can to shut you down. You got to do as much as you can to fight them off, because free speech matters. No matter if it's free speech for me, if it's free speech for somebody that I completely disagree with on the total opposite side, as long as they're not inciting violence or threatening me, then it's totally covered under freedom of speech. I don't care what they call me. They can call me whatever racial slur they want. I still would protect their right to say it. So please like, share, subscribe if you like the content. Shoot me an email if you have any ideas, criticisms. And don't forget to drop the mic on any friends. I'm trying to get the word out there because I'm still unable to post on Facebook right now because they're shutting down anything that's considered political as an advertisement. And I'm going through YouTube right now to try to advertise. We'll see what happens with that. I probably won't. They'll probably see what my content is and they'll turn me down, just like Facebook did. So just drop the mic on people whenever you get the opportunity or the chance to. And another thing is, I've been putting in a lot of these videos at the very end and today's a special day. Today's Veterans Day. I want to tip my cap to all of those individuals that go across the world to defend our freedoms. It's very admirable, and they're the best of us. They're the best that we have to offer in this country. So as you can see, every single video I put in the description on the very bottom to support our veterans and give money if you want to donate to the Wounded Warrior Project, or anything. I don't discriminate. They're not a sponsor, so it doesn't really matter in those ways. Like, you don't have to give to what I tell you to. If I'm asking, just give to whichever one you think is best, does the best job, is the most efficient. It's your money, you do what you want with it, but I would greatly appreciate it if you did so. And thank you. I will see you on Saturday or Sunday.